don't really care how long. Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. You have everything on?
I'm ready.
Alrighty. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm sitting with Ann Barkelew in California at a Page Society conference.
Right.
And it is Sunday, September 16th, 2007. And Ann has agreed to chat with me a little bit about her experiences in public relations. So let's start early on in your life, in your career. After you graduated from Central Missouri State University in 1957, you began your career as an English teacher and a journalism teacher. And you were a school administrator in Missouri and also in California school systems. And in 1966, you earned a Master of Education degree from the University of Missouri. How did you land in corporate PR?
Well, I think to get my start in public relations, you have to go back a little before I graduated from college. Because I really believe that I got my start selling cookies as a Girl Scout or calendars as a brownie. I think that all those experiences are experiences that teach you a lot about planning and involving other people and working as a member of a team. But after I graduated from college, I became a teacher because it was what I always wanted to do, and it mixed my love of journalism. I'd been a junior high school newspaper editor and a senior high school yearbook editor, and I went to workshops at the University of Missouri School of Journalism. So I didn't know exactly what it was I wanted to do in journalism, but I so admired a teacher I had that I decided I wanted to be a teacher too. So after doing that in Missouri for 3 or 4 years, I then had a chance to go west to California. California requires a 5th year for a permanent credential. And so I needed to go back to school. Now, during those 5 years of teaching, I had so many students wanting to take journalism that I had to divide them into 2 groups, and so I set up a news bureau, and I assigned beats, and we got on the radio, and we got on television. So in effect, I was doing public relations for the schools at the time. I was also sort of a militant teacher, and I used to go to school board meetings and say, why aren't we told all these things that are going on? So when I took a year off to get my master's degree, I audited a course in school public relations, and I was absolutely amazed to learn what you can do on purpose to help people understand more what's actually happening in the world around them. I had a wonderful professor at the University of Missouri, and as a result decided to do my master's thesis organizing a program of public relations for the Santa Barbara schools, which is where I was teaching. I was on leave from Santa Barbara, California. Well, I was going to go back and head the English department at a brand new high school, which is every English teacher's dream. And one morning, my superintendent in Santa Barbara called and said, we are going to assign you to the district office and let you put into practice what you've written in your thesis. So, I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And from that point in my life on, I never ever applied for a job. It was sort of like one public relations opportunity followed another. But in Santa Barbara, we dealt with the closing of schools that weren't earthquake safe. I learned to wheel and deal. Then I had a chance to go into Los Angeles to help them decide what kind of public information program they should have in their school, in the Los Angeles County schools, and designed a program for them, sort of out of the goodness of your heart kind of thing, and ended up being offered the job. So I went in and I took that job. And that was my first experience with PRSA. And I got accredited. I went through accreditation. And Betsy Plank signed my accreditation certificate. So think about that. I mean, that's in the 60s. And Betsy, there weren't very many women in the field. And here she was signing it. So that was a real highlight. While I was in Los Angeles County, we dealt with declining enrollment, court-ordered desegregation of schools, legislative mandated collective bargaining for teachers with vicious strikes. And I learned very quickly that it's a lot easier if you have done some things ahead of time to try to avoid these crises in the schools. So I was on a plane going back to talk to someone somewhere about collective bargaining in schools, and I sat next to a man from Munsingware. And he was really interested in the fact that schools had public relations people. And so as I told him about it, and I told him about closing schools, he said, you know, we have to close half of our plants, and we really don't want the unions to come in. Do you think you have some advice for us? And I said, you bet I do. And so I flew back later and met with the people at Munsingware and told them what I thought they ought to do. And they said, well, would you come back and help us do it? So for 6 months, I went back to work in Minnesota at Munsingware and ended up staying. I discovered I loved the seasons again. So I guess, and while I was at Munsingware, then they called from Dayton-Hudson one day and said, we have a job we'd like to talk to you about. So I'm really fortunate that I've had such incredible experiences. But the lesson in it all for me is that, and what I try to tell college students whenever I get a chance, is that public relations, if you're good at what you do, you can do it anywhere. It's the same basic thing. A school principal and a store manager and a plant manager are exactly the same. You know, the superintendent of schools is not a great deal unlike the CEO of a company. And you're dealing in the court of public opinion. In fact, sometimes I think public sector public relations is harder than private sector or corporate public relations.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow. Well, you mentioned Dayton-Hudson, and you joined them in '82 as Vice President of Corporate Relations, and you were with them approximately 14 years, directing PR efforts for many business ventures and crisis situations. First, could you talk a little bit about the problems that arose in 1990 when Dayton-Hudson Foundation withdrew funding to Planned Parenthood of Minnesota? Dayton-Hudson was always very generous, a very generous community sponsor, and they received a lot of negative publicity about this. How did you handle both the critics and the supporters of this action, and what eventually transpired?
It was the issue of the year, and that's what you have to understand, that it was the year of a gubernatorial election, and a lot of the legislative seats were up for re-election or contested elections, and it was a single issue campaign. You were either pro-choice or pro-life. Planned Parenthood nationally had run a lot of ads, both on the East Coast and all over the country. AT&T had just gone through a shareholder demand that addressed the same things with the AT&T's funding of Planned Parenthood programs. And it was defeated at their annual meeting, but nonetheless, it created a lot of attention. So there was a lot of activism going on. Now, Dayton-Hudson Foundation was the only part of Dayton-Hudson that gave money to Planned Parenthood, and it was because one of the founders of the company's wife was very involved in it. It was a grant in Minnesota for education in the public schools. It had nothing to do with clinics or anything like that. But, and we knew from employee surveys where employees would say, I'm a little uncomfortable, you know, that we're making this grant, or, and so we had decided to do away with to stop making the grant. And we had told them that we always, Dayton-Hudson was well known for making exit grants. And so you would say, we are not going to fund you in 3 years, but we are going to give you double funding for the next 3 years, so to tide you over and help you begin to plan what you're going to do without the Dayton-Hudson money. When we announced, when it was discovered that we were not going to continue the funding, I was in my office, and I got a phone call from a young man who said, "Hi, I'm Cope Moyers, Moyers, as in son of Bill Moyers. And I'm an intern at the Star Tribune in the St. Paul office, and I've just learned that your corporation is pulling its funding from Planned Parenthood. And what do you have to say about that?" And I said, "Can I call you back?" I said, "I really don't know what to say to you because I'm not aware of this." So I called the foundation people, and they said, "Oh, we put a copy of that in the mail, in the interoffice mail to you." And I said, "Oh, we've got some training to do at home." And I think it was because they had done the exit grant that they didn't really rush up and say this might become public. But Cope Moyers very generously gave me a couple of hours to come up with a response. And it was because it fed right into the political climate in Minnesota at the time, it became a really big issue. And but a big issue because people were already so polarized about it. So we were caught in the middle on that. And so we decided that the only thing to do, since we were a company that said we listened to our customers, that we should find out. We should convene bring in an impartial person and do some listening to find out what it is that people really were concerned about. So we brought in Jim Shannon, who had headed the General Mills Foundation for a number of years, and he talked to every side of the fence and a lot of people sitting on the fence, and he came forward with a recommendation. So this was one of those where you can't win no matter what you do, because what the recommendation was and what the foundation decided to do was to continue to support Planned Parenthood of Minnesota, but for a specific separate line item in their budget that dealt with teaching in the schools, providing materials for teaching in the schools about family planning or safe sex or whatever. And so, but nothing to do with the part that was so volatile. At that point in time, we were accused of flip-flopping, and so we received 9,000 cut-up credit cards in the first week. We received the ugliest mail that you can imagine. We had people in tears opening the mail. We responded, but we knew how to respond because we had to respond to every negative letter, and we did. We responded to every cut-up credit card, to everyone who wrote, to everyone who called, and over a period of about 3 weeks. And then we took out an ad in the New York Times and wrote an op-ed piece, and with a point-counterpoint kind of op-ed piece about why companies continue to give to things that may not fit what everyone thinks is the right way to do it. But I remember my CEO saying to me at the time, because Dayton Hudson was a real pioneer in giving, and the originator of 5% clubs all over the nation. And I remember him saying to me, "I've had so many phone calls from CEOs saying, 'Is it worth it? Is it worth it to give?'" And so the op-ed piece sort of addressed that, why it is important to continue to support the communities where you do business. In hindsight, would we have done anything differently? I suppose I'd have had the foundation give me a copy of the memo first,
Right.
But it was, we survived. The company came out of it very strong, and the elections were held in Minnesota, and it was the big issue. So I think it was one of those, retailers always say they want to be on trend. I think we were a little bit too much on trend at that point in time.
Did the op-ed piece really turn the tide for you?
I think it was one of those, I don't know that anything turned the tide. I think that what happens is that you simply have to ride some things out. You're not going to, there is no way. Look at the stories in the papers today, 20 years later. It is still an issue that is a divisive issue, and that part of the social agenda I don't think is going to change till people learn a new language.
Let's see. Well, let's move into 1987. At that time, you directed all the PR support that really helped defeat an attempted hostile takeover at Dayton Hudson. Now, Arthur Page once said that all business in a democratic society begins with public permission and exists by public approval. Now, I don't know if you actually thought about that statement, but could that statement, did it affect your approach in any decisions? Did you think about any of the Page principles and the kinds of things that Arthur Page stood for at that time when you were going through that takeover? And what was your strategy in working with the corporate lawyers? Because their first instinct would be to probably not say anything or as little as possible to the media, and that would be counter probably to what you would be wanting to do. So how did you handle that?
It was a very interesting time, and I was not yet a member of the Page Society, so I didn't really know about the Page principles. But being aware of the public and behaving like the public was the most important organization or group that your responsibility. That's how we did business all the time. I mean, we were a customer-oriented business, and that's why we gave to the communities where we did business. Long before the company was a public company, there was a belief that you had to be sure the communities where you did business were healthy, and so you gave back. And that gave people a reason to shop in your stores, but you listened to customers, you understood what was important to them. So when the day we learned that someone was beginning to accumulate shares of our stock, now this is right after we've been named the best managed corporation in America by the University of Southern California. And the general thought was that the only companies that people went after were companies that were poorly managed or, had some sort of issue to deal with, and that someone thought they could do it better. And so this was quite a surprise. We had another thing going for us, and that was we were a Minnesota incorporated company. Unlike many companies that are all incorporated in Delaware, we were incorporated in the state of Minnesota, so we were governed by Minnesota law. So as we sat down and thought to ourselves, well, about 60% of our stock changed hands in the course of a couple of weeks' time, and so we knew that there's something going on, and everyone is trying to track the stock. But as always, the most valuable source to us is the media, because they have all these sources, and they would call us and tell us who they had heard it was that was buying our stock. We met as a group. The CEO convened a group of his top advisors, and we brought in our outside advisors, and we looked at all of our options, and we decided that the best option, because we had always been so community focused, concerned about our employees, concerned about where we did business, was not to do a knee-jerk reaction kind of thing, but to very thoughtfully go to the state of Minnesota and say, let's look at the law. Let's see. We didn't think it was right. The people that were identified as accumulating our stock were green mailers. They were people that would come in and they would say they didn't really have a lot of money, but they could get enough money that they could buy a company, and then they would come in and break it up and sell it off. Or they would convince you to pay them so much for all their shares that they would green mail you into getting rid of them. Well, we didn't like that. That's not how we did business. And so we said, let's look at the laws. If someone has good money and wants to buy this company, then you have some fiduciary duties that you can't ignore. But we don't think it's right that you can come in and break up our company and sell it off. So we decided that's the way we were going to go, and thus began what we referred to as 7 days in June. And it was a 7-day program that started with a visit to the governor, and who famously said on television that when the CEO called and said, I have to meet with you this evening, he said to his wife, have you overcharged at Dayton's? But at that point in time, we drew up ads to run in newspapers statewide. We commissioned a poll of people of Minnesota to find out if they thought that changing the law, strengthening the law to prevent people coming in and busting up companies We had a slogan that said, "I like Dayton-Hudson whole, not halved," because the people coming after us were the halves. And so we launched a 7-day campaign to convince the people of Minnesota that the governor should call a special session and change the law to prevent people from coming in without good money. And so that was what we learned in the survey of people of Minnesota was they all agreed that something should be done. But we had thought it would be because of all the money we'd given or all the contributions we'd made. What we found was the people of Minnesota said, yes, do something for them because they have this wonderful liberal return policy. And they've trusted us all these years. They've never asked for a receipt, or they've just taken it back if we said we bought it there. So, and that was the tipping point that made it safe for the legislators to agree to have a special session. And so that was the program, and it was the most covered story in the United States because we were fighting a hostile takeover threat. Because so much stock had traded hands and because these people were sort of colorful. Mm-hmm. And they owned Crown Books, which was a discount bookstore, and at the time we owned B. Dalton Bookseller, which was now what you know today as Barnes & Noble. But it was if we could go back and do it over again, there are lots of things we would do over again, and one of them was how to deal with lawyers. Because this is something, in one of our meetings, my CEO said, have any of you ever done this before? And we all said no. We've never been through this kind of thing before. So when you have investment bankers and lawyers and everyone telling you, you can't say this, you can't say that, you can't say this, and we kept saying, but we can respond to the media, we can put out news releases, why can't we communicate with our employees? But corporate lawyers don't like paper. And so they would discourage that. We did a lot of presentations after it was over saying, if we could do this again, what would we do differently? And the number one thing is that we would have communicated more quickly with our own employees. And I think the turning point was the day that the CEO said, just tell the lawyers and the bankers to back off because I'm the captain of this ship. And we're going to start calling the signals here. And it was an incredible experience for a company, the leadership of a company, to go through a threat to the company, not just the way you've always had it, but something you believe in. Now, the interesting thing with the law is that it was the first time that a law was passed that said that a corporation had to pay attention to its communities where it did business and to its employees, and not just to shareholders. So.
Well, during all that, and you were probably grappling with some ethical issues, did Dayton-Hudson have an ethical mission statement? Did you refer to it?
We had a whole book. And it was the way you passed the culture on as the company was growing. Mm-hmm. When I went to Dayton-Hudson, we were about a $5 billion company. And when I left, when I retired, it was about $28 billion. So, and we were growing so rapidly that the people that the senior management felt it was important to write the culture down. And so it wasn't a one-page credo, but it was very clear-cut that we are in business to serve customers and that we aim to be America's premier retailer. And that says a lot of things. And then it says that we will always pay attention to the communities where we do business, that we will help them be healthy. And so all these things that were there that talked about how we did business were really the guiding principle in a lot of things. If I can use one other example about how that credo influenced how you behaved, we discovered that we had some records and tapes and things like that back in the day when they made records. But tapes and that kind of piece of business at Target is a big business. And prints came out with an album where on the jacket cover, and if you remember, go back to that period of time in the 80s, when you would walk into a store, you would see the record jacket covers prominently displayed as you went down the aisle. Well, on this particular one, he was strategically posed without any clothing on. And so the decision was, we're a family store. We operate family stores. And so it took like 5 seconds to decide that we weren't going to carry that, even though it was a big margin business. And it was driven by the fact that that's the kind of company we are. And so it guided just your automatic reaction to a lot of things. Arthur Page would have been proud of this.
You retired from Dayton Hudson, and wait, we're going to start this one over. I have so many things scratched out and written here. I'm going to read over this again. Okay, retired from Dayton Hudson. All right, if I say,
Go ahead.
okay, if I say okay, you retired from Dayton Hudson, and then your position was eliminated.
Mhm.
Is that correct? Okay, and okay, all right, I'm ready.
You could say after you retired, or
Well, that's true.
whatever.
Okay. All right. After you retired from Dayton Hudson, your position was eliminated, and at approximately the same time, another woman who held a power position with the corporate foundation also resigned. Her name was Cynthia Maeda.
Maeda.
Okay. Now, you and Miss Maeda were instrumental in saving Dayton Hudson from that takeover. And the media quoted an insider at Dayton Hudson as saying, the guys are now running the company. Talk a little bit about your reaction to the elimination of your position after you retired, and what it was like for a woman to be in a position of power in the 80s and the early 90s.
Cynthia and I never really knew that we were running the company, so that's sort of fun. Cynthia, actually, I think that Cynthia and I probably became best known during the Planned Parenthood issue because we were both big contributors to Planned Parenthood as individuals, and the media liked to make a lot out of that, but at any rate. It always hurts when you've built a function to see it change, but I'm sure that it's the right of every CEO of every company to organize things the way they want to organize them. And when I retired, I had promised myself I would retire by the time I was 60. I'd worked my whole life, and that was just a couple of months before I turned 60. So that after my CEO retired, it was about 6 months before I retired because it was different, and I think when I sort of felt like the CEO needed his own press secretary, and that's what happens. Sometimes you'll see the function change, get split up, whatever, and that always hurts because there's a certain degree of pride in what you have built. But you go on, you move on, and when people ask you what you think, you always don't freely offer advice because you're no longer part of the company. But it's a great company, and I think that the thing that excites me most is that now, about 13 years later, the function is now coming back together. And it's that, the pendulum swings, and the function was different when I started. We built it, we added a lot to it, and so I think probably the media was the most disappointed because we were very open and very accessible to the public. And so I think that was probably the most disappointing part. But nonetheless, it was a great 14 years. And I loved my CEO. He was just a great partner. He paid attention to things that we talked about, and we really felt like we were at the policy table. So that was important. And if you're not, why then it's time to move on and do something else. I think Cynthia felt the same way. And because the foundation changed a lot too, the external relations parts. Being a woman in a senior management position is, I guess, I just always thought of it as being part of doing what I did. When I was in my first management position in 1966, when there were not many women in public school management. You had a lot of women teachers, but not many women principals, and your district administrators were primarily all men. When I attended the first meetings of the public relations seminar and even the Page Society, when I did first come into that group, there were not a lot of women in senior leadership positions. There were more and more women going into the field, but the leaders were still mostly men. And that was, so I think it's all, there's just this era of, what you do is you work harder and you work longer hours. And you do it because I don't know that you feel like you have to prove anything. I think it's just that that's the way we are. We do work harder. We're a little bit more inclusive. I was the first woman named to the Dayton-Hudson Management Committee, which was the senior group of managers, and that was really an exciting time, and people were always asking me what it was like, and I said I was the only one who didn't have to stand in line at the bathroom breaks, because there were a lot of men and then there was me. But and it was just an exciting time to be part of this movement of women proving that we can do whatever anyone else can do. But it was, I guess, I never wanted to be part of the mold of women in management. I wanted to be me. So when I arrived at Dayton-Hudson, now you have to remember I was a teacher for a long time, and I never wore black on a test day because I always felt, kids, I don't care how old they are, they respond to color. And I wanted them to feel upbeat about taking a test. And so I didn't own a navy blue suit. I didn't own a floppy tie. And yet that's what people were wearing. And I never bought a navy blue suit. And so I thought it was sort of, maybe it's just because I was in public relations. I thought it was fun to be a little different and pretty exciting to be leading the way. Now, a comment I would make, and I hope that young women, if they pull this tape out and look at it, will pay attention to the fact that my best mentors were men. I did not find a lot of women really interested in helping other women. And that bothered me a lot. So I think my generation of women, I have a lot of friends who are my same age, and they were also, whether they were Secretary of State of Minnesota or whatever, we always felt an obligation to try to help other women. And we formed women's network groups to try to help women learn the skills. But it was hard because there was something about, there weren't a lot of women supporting other women, and that bothered me. So I'm a big supporter of, whenever asked to speak to a women's group, I never say no.
It's so interesting that you brought up about the mentor, because I was going to ask you about that. So what was next for you after Hudson?
Well, I promised myself I'd quit smoking before I turned 50, and I did. That I would retire before I turned 60, and I did. But once it was announced that I was leaving, I got a lot of phone calls from people saying, well, would you come and do this project for us and this project for us? So I immediately retired and went to work on 3 projects. I helped create some good public relations programs for Musicland, working with Marcia Apple, their senior vice president, and being a sort of an outside consultant for her. And then I did a needs assessment for Kohl's Media to help them determine how they ought to be organized for public relations and communications. And then I had my most interesting assignment, and I got called in to help the Minnesota Vikings and head coach Dennis Green, who became one of my very good friends. But he was the first African American head coach in the NFL, and he had come to Minnesota and with a very successful career behind him, but a lot of people wanting to attack him. And so there were some source not to be named kinds of stories that ran in the newspaper. So I was hired to help Dennis and the Minnesota Vikings deal with those issues. And that was, so it was 3 really wildly different assignments. And I was so busy, and I really did not like going to Kinko's to copy all my stuff. So I figured I really did need a copy machine. About that time, John Graham from Flushman Hillard, whom I've known forever and whom I've admired for many years, and we're both from Missouri, so we sort of were souls of the same nature. And he called and said, I want to put a flag up in Minnesota, and I'd like for you to do it for me. And I said, no, you have the wrong person. I don't like agencies. I never used them. I thought they were all overrated. So I'm the wrong person for you. And he said, well, let's talk about that. And there was one exception. I really liked Kexton Company in New York, and I told him why I liked them. And he said, well, why don't you open an office for Flushman Hillard in Minnesota that you would have hired? And so I said, ooh, that's a great challenge, I could do that. And so so we did. We opened an office, and I gathered together. We started out with 5 people, and our initial revenues were $400,000 in Minnesota. And then at the end of 6 years, when I retired again, we were at 35 people and $7 million, and the 3rd largest agency in the Twin Cities. So that was pretty exciting.
Right. Wow. What's interesting is that I believe at the time there was some general noise that it was too competitive an environment, and people just didn't hold out a lot of hope for you or even for the success of the office, right? And what was a big challenge?
Well, the big challenge was that Flushman Hillard is an international agency, and no big national agency had ever survived in Minnesota. It's a very, very proud of Minnesota offices, very proud of Minnesota companies. That's why so many companies that are Minnesotan are incorporated in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. But I think Burson Marsteller had been in there a couple of times. Hill and Knowlton had been there a couple of times, and they closed the offices, and people moved on to other places. But so I said, now there was a Shandwick office, a Weber Shandwick office there, but they were there because they bought a local agency, and so then they just changed the name. But most people in town still called it Mona Meyer and McGrath. So, so that was a challenge and it was what we ran into on every new business pitch. People would say, well, we understand you're sort of pricey because you're a big national, we have all these offices and everything. And I said, I am competitive with any piece of offer that you may get from someone else. What we did was we really promoted the fact that we were all Minnesota people, mm-hmm. and that we did all of our business in Minnesota. We weren't just housed in Minnesota, but we were an office that focused on Minnesota companies and on Minnesota business. And so we were there to stay. And we also didn't bait and switch. I mean, we looked at all the things that had always bugged me about agencies, and we corrected those, and it worked. So it was great fun. And it made my career then very interesting, because I'd had public sector PR experience, corporate PR experience, and then finally agency experience. So having done all 3, I then could retire. Sort of.
Well, you stepped down from that management position in 2001. Uh-huh. Here you are, you're still attending Page Society conferences. What's going on now? What are you up to now?
Oh my gosh, I am so busy. I'm now doing for free what I used to get paid to do. Okay. And I think that's important because you don't lose your interest, you don't lose your edge, you don't lose, I mean, look around at you, there's a cadre of people that haven't stopped giving back just because we've stopped earning a salary, which is all it really is, the difference. And so I'm on the board of I was on the board of the St. Paul Red Cross, and we decided to merge Minneapolis and St. Paul into one new chapter, the Twin Cities Area Red Cross chapter, and so I helped with the unification process. It was not at all unlike merging Dayton's and Hudson's into one department store division or any kind of merger of companies like that. It's the same basic principles. I led a branding effort for the rebranding, the clarified branding of the Minnesota Humanities Commission. And then now I'm in charge of marketing and public relations for an organization called Women Winning, which we just have a new name in Minnesota, and it's the Minnesota Women's Campaign Fund. And we raise the money to fund the races of bipartisan pro-choice women. So at any rate, there's a lot to be done and staying very busy.
Well, you must be, and keeping up with 11 grandchildren.
Yeah.
You must be extremely busy.
The joy of my life. The joy of my life. There's an old saying, if we could have had grandchildren first. It's really great, and I'm very fortunate to now have the luxury of some time to do that to pay that kind of attention.
Oh, that's wonderful. Let's talk a minute about counseling. I've had other interviews with other Page Society members, and they've expressed some concern over the current state of corporate public relations and the decline in the number of PR counselors to corporate CEOs. It's been noted that individuals who've been indicted in recent waves of corporate scandals, and there have been many of those, have not held PR positions. So does that mean that those of you who held the counseling positions were the ethics police, guiding the upper management towards making the correct ethical decisions? Is the trend changing now? Are we getting back into having counselors to CEOs and having the PR person at the policy-making table?
I don't feel quite as discouraged about corporate PR in the last decade as some may have been. I think we have fewer companies today because there have been so many mergers, and so we don't see maybe as many people, and a lot of senior people retired, and functions may have shifted or changed a little bit or been integrated in a different way. But I feel like there's still wonderful, solid corporate public relations practice going on today, and there are still hundreds of people sitting at the table helping CEOs make decisions. So I guess I'm not quite as gloom and doom about that as some may be. Maybe it isn't all being done the way it used to be, but I don't think that's all that bad. I do believe that the role has changed as you would expect it to, because we have more things available to us. I mean, we talk about how the kinds of technology we have available. Those of us that started on a manual typewriter and then, thought we had died and gone to heaven when we had a self-correcting selectric, where you didn't have to, or you didn't have to use carbon paper anymore, or things like that. And going from mailing news releases to faxing news releases to the electronic transfer of something, when you're disclosing information. I don't mean that everything is news releases, but for those times when you have to make public announcements, to now just going, on the wire directly. It's amazing, the speed of information, and I think that has changed a lot of what we do. The being at the table, we used to always say, oh, if we could just get to the table. I wasn't quite so sure it was all of that glorious at times to be at the table, but the fact is, what you want to be a place where you have the ear of the CEO, and where you can, because it's what you're doing are really the CEO's job. And so, I mean, in terms of public relationships, the reputation of the corporation. And so you become a partner. It isn't just you doing it. I mean, you're the CEO's partner. So I think that our counseling role is still there. It just may not be in the same form that it used to be. But I do feel like CEOs are still listening a lot. At least the CEOs I know are still paying a lot of attention to what their chief communications officer, chief public relations officer is telling them. Now, when you do have a problem, then I always say to people, pray for a crisis. Because whenever you have a crisis, then everybody says, where are those PR people? Let's bring them in here and let them show what they can do. And that is a time. I mean, it's just not all crises are bad. It's a great time to show what we can do, and to really show how we have as much business sense as anyone else. If we have lost that key to the door, if we've lost that, then I think it's because we haven't paid enough attention to how business is changing, or we've wanted to hold on to an old way of doing something when we needed to move more into a strategic counseling mindset, and not just into tactics or we can solve this by working with the media. There isn't time. By the time the paper comes out or a television program goes on, someone's been yelling on a blog or somewhere they've already changed how people think about a company. So it is it's an exciting time, but I just think it's a kind of a different time for PR people. It doesn't fit the old model.
Okay, that's great. It's let's talk a second about PR education. You've had some experience. You've worked with college students, and you seem to enjoy that from a previous conversation that we had. Do you believe that college graduates are entering today's workforce prepared for informed ethical decision-making?
If they don't let ego get in the way. I mean, I think what we're seeing today is sort of a battle between ethics and ego. I mean, I think where people are guided by what they know is the right thing to do. I personally, once I became accredited by PRSA, and this may sound sort of corny, but I put up the PRSA Code of Ethics. I had it laminated and permaplaqued and put it up on the wall in my office. And people would come in and they'd be looking around and they'd say, "What's this?" And I said, "That's the Code of Ethics of my professional association." And it was really fun to see them respond to, "Oh, you have a Code of Ethics?" And I used to love to say, "No, doesn't your profession have?" I mean, yes, I do. Doesn't your profession have one? After I became a member of the Page Society, I did the same thing with the Page Principles. And I do think that sometimes you need something on the wall, a little bit like Johnson & Johnson had the Credo that everyone had on their desk, so that when something happens, you know what to look at. I was fortunately never asked to do something that didn't fit one of those, either the PRSA Code of Ethics or the Page Principles. I was never asked to do anything that wouldn't have been considered ethical. But I do believe that if I had been, I would have. Now there were times when some people would say, "Well, maybe we could postpone that," and we'd say, "No. I think you have to, but you don't do it by saying, 'No, that's not an ethical thing to do.' I mean, I think you just do it by always keeping your eye focused on what is right." I hope that doesn't sound too corny,
No.
but it is. I think coming to meetings like this one, like the Page Society conferences, reinforces a lot of that. This is what we stand for. This is what we believe in. When Dayton Hudson was hit with the Planned Parenthood issue, within 30 minutes of the phone call that I got from Colt Moyers, I called Marilyn Laurie at AT&T, and I said to her assistant, I said, this is Ann Barkelew at Dayton-Hudson. I'm in the seminar with Marilyn, because at the time I wasn't yet in the Page Society. At the time, I don't know the Page Society had opened up beyond the ranks of telephone company people. But at any rate, I said, tell Marilyn that I have Planned Parenthood knocking on my door, and I would really like to talk to her. She called me back within 15 minutes. We spent a half an hour on the phone, and it was one of those, Marilyn, if you were doing this, you know, how would you respond? And so I think the kind of sharing and learning that we get from each other is, I mean, that's sort of what Arthur Page was talking about too, is this what we can do together is so much stronger than what we can do separately.
Well, let's take a second and look at if you were at this point in time getting ready to hire a senior management person, what kind of qualities would you be looking for in today's world? And would that have been different from what you had been looking for in the 80s and 90s? What are those characteristics that you look for in a PR professional?
Well, I tell you, I just used to shudder when I would be talking to someone and I'd say, why do you think you want to go into this field? And they'd say, because I like people. And I used to always say, that's not a requirement. You know, this is not what we do. I want somebody who's smart. I want somebody who has a track record. Now you're talking about a senior position. I want somebody who really has had a variety of experiences. If I can find somebody who's had some public sector experiences, I will lean that way, because I think there is great public relations practiced in the public sector, and I encourage young people to look at the public sector. The world is not created in corporate America. There is wonderful public relations being practiced in hospitals and in all kinds of nonprofit organizations. I think of, you know, everyone has read about the bridge collapse in Minnesota within the last month. And Ted Canova, the head of public relations for the American Red Cross, became a voice that was heard around the world and put really the right kind of perspective, added that perspective to this tragic happening. But it was his good thinking, his good sense, and his background is media and the public arena. So I would really tip, you know, if I were struggling between several people to hire, someone that's had some public sector experience, I think is really, that's a great plus. I want people who are creative, and I guess I've always looked for people that have a spark. I want somebody who gets excited about coming to work in the morning. And when I do talk to college students, and I always tell them that the job they want is a job where when they're going in the elevator or walking in the door of where they work, that their heart beats fast. And when it doesn't beat fast, then look for something else to do. Because in our field, you need that passion. You need that great love of what you do that makes it possible to, you know, to sort of slug through some of the stuff to get to the good points in time. I want people with a sense of humor. But I want people who can listen. I really am bored by people who talk too much and who seem to have the answer to every question. Because I used to always say when I taught school that William Shakespeare did not, unfortunately for many high school English teachers, did not publish a teacher's guide. So if you interpret it one way, who's to say you're not right? You know. So I really like people who are good thinkers, and that's what I look for.
Very good. Looking back on your life, for which of your accomplishments are you most proud of, and why?
I have thought about that since you asked me, since you gave me a heads up you were going to ask me that question. I've thought about that, and I suppose professionally, there are two things that I'm really proud of. One of them is, I always say, keeping Dayton-Hudson whole, not halved. I think what we did in public relations in that whole program made a difference, and it made it possible for the return policy to still be there, and for Santa Bear to survive, and it was being part of that team, that everyone listened to each other, and public relations really had a great strong voice, and it was, and I'm very proud of that as a professional. I'm very proud of the fact that we were given the authority to pay attention to communities and to employees on the same level where companies, publicly held companies, pay attention to shareholders. That's good. The other thing I'm proud of is the fact that there is today in Minneapolis an institution called the Children's Theater. Dayton-Hudson liked for its executives to be involved in the community, and I loved that because I'd always liked being part of the community. But when they came to me and said, would I like to be on the board of the ballet, I said, no, I like to see ballet occasionally, but there's no passion. But they had an opening on the board of the Children's Theater. Now, this is a theater that is created for children and their families. As one board member used to say, for the young at heart. It provides professional theater experience, and you train, the professional productions, playwrights come in. Tommy DiPaolo used to write stories just to be performed at the Children's Theater. He's a wonderful children's author. And it makes Minnesota a special place. Well, 2 weeks after I went on the board, the artistic director of the theater was arrested for sexual abuse of young boys. And that's how I spent my summer. I immediately said, we have to have a PR committee. We have to know how to respond to this. And every television station at the time, the general managers went on and did editorials on the air. And they all went on saying the place should be shut down and locked up, the key thrown away, it's an incestuous, awful place. And it was the wrong response for a community. And so there were 7 of us that spent our summer as the interim executive committee sort of redoing. Every arts organization in town said, we all have a stake in this. None of our policies are all that great for knowing what was going on. How do you get fundraisers to feel good about what they're giving to? We were operating a school, but we worked hard, and we emerged at the end of the summer with a new season. And 5 years later, we became the first theatrical exchange representing the United States of America with what was then the Soviet Union. And we went to Moscow and put our company on stage. And I sat in the audience and thought to myself, if we hadn't really mobilized and said, we are not going to let you shut this place down, because it is, this is like eliminating a position when someone leaves. You don't just simply get rid of something. You hold on to things that make your community special. 2 years ago, the Children's Theater won the Tony on Broadway for the best regional theater. The day that they learned they'd won the Tony, the managing director of the theater called and said, thank you for helping us be here, which was a wonderful thing. So professionally, what you can do as a volunteer and what you can do for what you're paid to do can give you great fulfillment in your life.
That's wonderful. Well, we're really just about finished here, but is there anything else that you'd like to talk about that maybe we haven't covered? Anything that you want to tell the next generation of PR professionals?
I thought about that too, and I put together, can I just do it this way, do you mind?
No,
Okay,
Just
all right.
a minute, please.
is there anything else that you would like to talk about that we really haven't covered in the interview? Any other useful information or anything you might want to share with the next generation of PR professionals?
I've had a lot of wonderful experiences in my career, and it covered a lot of decades in many different arenas. But I thought about, with all the experiences that I was so fortunate to have, what are the lessons that I learned as a result of those that I could offer to the next generation? And the first one is, I have 12 of them here, and the first one is, it is increasingly important to be a public relations generalist. So not just focused on one particular field, like financial public relations or media relations, but it's very important to be a generalist. The second lesson is that there are great opportunities in the public sector as well as in the private sector. And the world of nonprofit is another great opportunity for people to going into public relations. The third lesson is the importance of patience as you learn and earn your place at the table. The young people today want immediacy. They want to talk to the CEO tomorrow. And I always say that the best counselors are ones that know that they can, their job is to make someone else look good. It isn't all just how we put ourselves forward. So I think that you have to be patient in getting these experiences before you can really make it to the CEO's office to give advice, even though your advice may be really good when you're so young. The fourth one is how important our function is to the success of the organizations we're part of. It is a critically important function, and we must never just sit idly by and let it get pushed aside. We need to speak up and to find ways to work with other people. In my first PR job, I kept in the schools. I kept a list of every school, and I actually put a check mark beside when I'd get a story in the paper, I'd have something in a newsletter, or do a project for a school. And if I saw that there were some I wasn't doing anything to help, then I'd go find something to do. So I think finding a way to integrate the function into the whole organization is really important. Doing your homework is a daily opportunity. This is not a job where you can just casually approach it. You have to read the paper, you have to read magazines, you have to go look at the blogs, you have to know how the internet works and know how to make it work for you. The sixth lesson is that effective public relations leaders are the common denominator in their organizations. I really believe that we are that common denominator. We are the common ground for HR, for finance, for control, for the foundations, for any kind of function. We speak the language that everyone can understand. So to be that kind of go-to person, I always tell people that there are lots of decisions made after 5. And so this is not a 9-to-5 job or an 8-to-5 job. And I found that my CEO used to drop by my office about 6 o'clock in the evening almost every day. And we did a lot of decision making at that point in time that was very, very fulfilling. So at any rate, the seventh lesson is the importance of the relationship with the CEO and the rest of the top management team. Respect and credibility are earned. They're not just given. And so it's important that you build those relationships. The eighth lesson is to be a full-fledged player in business decisions and in planning the future of the organizations means that we have to be leaders. We have to step up and demonstrate our leadership skills and be leaders. And today I think that means being really authentic, about being real about what we do. So we need to understand the business. We need to really be a full-fledged player. The ninth lesson is to accept the responsibilities of being a doer and not just a delegator. Most CEOs today will say, I want to know who's responsible. And so sometimes you see people at the top and they say, well, the CEO goes around me. Well, the reason is, I believe, that CEOs stop seeing some people as the fact that we're the ones that we're not just responsible, but we also can do that kind of thing. And I think CEOs want to see us in charge and want to see us as leaders. The 10th lesson is the importance of collaboration, bringing people together, helping them discover a common language, and realizing that it's what we can accomplish working together on projects, being the establishing a collaborative environment. The 11th lesson is that it's hard work. There aren't always a lot of not a lot of monetary benefits, but there are great non-monetary benefits that come with this job. It is never boring. No 2 days are ever the same. It is always exciting, and it can always be fun, I think. And then my final lesson is never stop learning. You're never too old to keep learning, and look at every opportunity as a learning experience. So those are my 12 offerings for lessons based on my experience in the field.
Well, they're wonderful. And I'm so happy that you've shared everything with us today. It's been very interesting. And I want to thank you so much for taking your time away from all of your friends who I hear bustling about out there and just sitting down and talking with us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for asking me. I'm honored.
Thank you very much.